The Council on Foreign Relations. The British East India Company. The British East India Company was a British commercial and political organization established in India in the late 1600s, which was known as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London. A forerunner of this group was the London Mercers Company, and earlier than that, the London Staplers. The organization traced their lineage back to the ancient commercial groups involved in trading between the Mediterranean and India. They were closely related to the Levant Company, and the Anglo-Muscovy Company, and spawned the London Company, which was chartered in 1606 by King James I, to establish the Virginia Plantation on a communistic basis, and the Plymouth Colony in 1621. It was mainly organized for trading, but soon became an agent for British imperialism. Bending to government pressure, they reorganized in 1702. Every year, 24 directors were elected by the Court of Proprietors, or shareholders, a majority of which were English Masons. They traded in cotton, tea, silk, and saltpeter, and were accused of dealing with opium and participating in the slave trade. They virtually monopolized all trade from South India, the Persian Gulf, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Indian policy was influenced by the company from 1757 to 1773, when their power was broken by the 1773 Regulatory Act, and Pitt's India Act of 1784, finally ending their monopoly in 1813. When they ceased to exist in 1873, many of its shareholders were major financiers. The principals of this group perpetuated their elitist goals by establishing the Fabian Society. In 1606, King James also chartered the Virginia Company, a joint stock corporation made up of a group of London entrepreneurs, charged with establishing Jamestown, in the Chesapeake region of North America known as Virginia. It had the authority to appoint the Council of Virginia, the governor, and other officials, and also had the responsibility to provide settlers, supplies, and ships for the venture. Although initially favorable, as the mortality rate rose, and the prospect for profit faded, the support for it began to decline. They resorted to lotteries, searching for gold, and silkworm production to increase their chances of making a profit. Although Great Britain controlled the colony through this company, because of the Indian massacre of 1622, the charter was revoked in 1624, and Virginia became a crown colony. The Fabian Society. In October 24, 1883, in London, a group of 17 wealthy socialists gathered to discuss a fellowship of the new life, which was based on the writings of scholar Thomas Davidson, who hoped to start some sort of monastic order. The group included George Bernard Shaw, 1864-1926, a free-thinking Marxist atheist writer whose plays contained socialistic references, an ideology he pursued after hearing a speech by American economist Henry George in 1882, and reading Marx's Das Kapital. Graham Wallas, a classical scholar. Sidney James Webb, 1859-1947, a civil servant who was the most influential socialist in the country. Edward Pease, Havelock Ellis, Frank Podmore, Annie Besant, John Galsworthy, R. H. Tawney, G. D. H. Cole, Harold Losky, Israel Zangwill, 1864-1926, a Jewish playwright and novelist, who in 1910, wrote the play The Melting Pot, which was a propaganda play showing how Americans discriminated against blacks and Jews, and Israel Cohen, a Jewish writer. Some of these people were also members of the Society for Physical Research, an organization dedicated to spiritualism research, which was founded in 1882. Sidney Webb later founded the London School of Economics in 1895, which became a branch of the University of London. Among its major contributors, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust, and Mrs. Ernest Elmhurst, the widow of J.P. Morgan partner Willard Straight, who founded the socialist magazine New Republic. In 1912, Webb established an independent journal called The New Statesman, and later became a leader in the Labour Party, writing Labour and the Social Order in 1918. He held several political offices, and was a disciple of John Stuart Mill, who served as the secretary of the British East India Company. On November 7, 1883, this group met to discuss the establishment of an organization whose ultimate aim shall be the reconstruction of society in accordance with the highest moral possibilities. However, they split into two factions, and on January 4, 1884, one of the factions established a group known as the Fabian Society. On January 25, one member, J. G. Stapleton, delivered their first lecture, called Social Conditions in England, with a view to social reconstruction or development. At a time when there were 30,000 socialist voters, after a few weeks, they only had 20 members. In April 1884, their first publication was distributed, a 4-page pamphlet called Why Are We Poor? In May, journalist George Bernard Shaw, who would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1925, joined, and soon became the leading figure of the Fabians. In March 1885, Sidney Webb, then a clerk from the Colonial Office, joined, and in 1886, so did Graham Wallas. Shaw, Webb, Wallace, and Sidney Olivier became known as the Big Four. The other faction, known as the Fellowship, continued for 15 years under Davidson, with members such J. Ramsay MacDonald, who later became Prime Minister, Edward Carpenter, and Havelock Ellis. Their pamphlet Facts for Socialists in 1887 maintained that any person who knew the facts of socialism had no other choice but to be one. It was their best-selling piece of propaganda. In 1884, John W. Martin and Reverend W. D. P. Bliss moved to Boston, M.A., and established a magazine known as the American Fabian. The move was an unsuccessful effort to bring the Fabian socialistic movement to New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Chicago. By 1889, 6,500 tracts had been distributed, and 31 speakers had delivered 721 lectures. From 1891-92, there had been 3,339 lectures given by 117 Fabian members. Their membership rose to 400 by 1892, 681 in 1894, and 881 in 1899. They had 74 local chapters in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Spain, Denmark, and Germany. In 1899, the Fabian Essays, the most noted work on socialism, was written by 7 influential members of the Society, and edited by Shaw. It became the blueprint for socialistic legislation, and was later reprinted in 1908, 1920, 1931, and 1952. Fabian leaders were drawn to Herbert George Wells, 1866 to 1946, and his ideas of the new republic, which he described as a sort of outspoken secret society, an informal and open Freemasonry, made up of the educated class, whose common goals would lead to the creation of a new world state, thus saving the human race from disaster. Known as the prophet of our time because of writing about many things before they came to be, in books like The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, Wells would give the Fabians the notoriety they needed. Edward Pease, secretary of the Fabians, wrote to H. G. Wells on January 10, 1902, to say that Webb and his wife Beatrice were the pioneers of your new republic. Sponsored by Wallace and Shaw, Wells joined them in February 1903. In his first lecture after joining, he said that the world state was a necessity. In his 1905 book, A Modern Utopia, he wrote of the world state taking control and creating a sane order, and how they maintained a central records system in Paris, which they used to keep track of every person on earth, and aided the state to eliminate the unfit. Wells was unimpressed with the Fabians, and called for expansion, by raising money, getting new offices, appointing a new staff, and relaxing the guidelines for membership. He wanted to initiate an all-out propaganda campaign, and outlined his views in a paper called The Faults of the Fabians, which dealt with the need for reorganization, and why he wanted to change their name to the British Socialist Society. His views were not shared by the Fabian inner circle, and in September 1908, he resigned. Wells maintained his socialistic views, and in 1928, wrote The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, which was an elaboration of ideas from his 1926 book The World of William Clissold, which gave a 7-point program for the development of the new human community, and was inspired by the rise of communism. These ideas had been fleshed out in his 1897 short story A Story of the Days to Come, and his 1901 book, Anticipations of the Reaction to Mechanical and Scientific Progress Upon Human Life and Thought. The character, Clissold, had called his project for world revolution, The Open Conspiracy, which meant, the establishment of the economic world state by the deliberate invitation, explicit discussion, and cooperation of the men most interested in economic organization, men chosen by their work, called to it by a natural disposition and aptitude for it, fully aware of its importance and working with the support of an increasing general understanding. It is not a project to overthrow existing governments by insurrectionary attacks, but to supersede them by disregard. It does not want to destroy them or alter their forms but to make them negligible by replacing their functions. It will respect them as far as it must. What is useful of them it will use, what is useless it will efface by its stronger reality. It will join issue only with what is plainly antagonistic and actively troublesome. His plan was to be accomplished by an intelligent minority, without the support of the crowd and possibly in spite of its dissent. The Open Conspiracy was Wells' perspective of his new republic, which represented a classless world state that controlled everything. Its establishment would be accomplished by functional men of high natural intelligence and professional competence, who performed the creative and managerial work of the world. They were recruited from the men and women whose knowledge, skill, creative gifts made them indispensable to modern society, who would gradually have the reins of power into their hands. The revolution was to begin through the formation of small groups of friends, family groups, groups of students and employees or other sorts of people meeting and conversing frequently in the course of normal occupations. They were to enlarge themselves and attempt to establish communications with kindred groups for common ends. He further elaborated, the open conspiracy will appear first, I believe, as a conscious organization of intelligent, and in some cases wealthy men, as a movement having distinct social and political aims, confessedly ignoring most of the existing apparatus of political control, or using it only as an incidental implement in the stages, a mere movement of a number of people in a certain direction, who will presently discover, with a sort of surprise, the common object toward which they are all moving. In all sorts of ways, they will be influencing and controlling the ostensible government. He also wrote, from the outset, the open conspiracy will set its face against militarism, in the sense that they will encourage refusal to serve in any war, as conscientious objectors. For the furtherance of its aims, the open conspiracy may work in alliance with all sorts of movements and people, and, restricted movements will attend only to a portion of its program. According to Wells, expansion would occur through branching and development, with the open conspiracy as consisting of a great multitude and variety of overlapping groups, but now all organized for collective political, social and educational as well as propagandist action. They will recognize each other much more clearly than they did at first, and they will have acquired a common name. The character of the open conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as widespread and evident as socialism and communism. It will largely have taken the place of these movements. It will be more. It will be a world religion. This large loose assimilatory mass of groups and societies will be definitely and obviously attempting to swallow up the entire population of the world and become the new human community. 2 years later, in a published article titled The Banker, Wells even included the international banking houses in Clissold's open conspiracy through a 3-point program that would bypass governments by negotiating agreements stabilizing the currency, adjusting credit availability to control the fluctuation of business, and the withdrawal of credit to governments or armament industries who instigate an arms race. It is obvious that Wells either based his writings on the actual plans of the Fabian elitists, or used his knowledge of what they had already done in order to formulate a theory of what they were going to do in the future. Since he did quit, were these writings meant to be an expose or a warning? Or was he just stating facts, daring people to try and stop them? We don't know his intent, but what we do know was that he was incredibly prophetic in his description of their methods. It would indeed be a blueprint for the manner in which the Illuminati would entrench itself in our governmental affairs. Edward Bernays, former head of CBS TV, and a friend of H.G. Wells, wrote in his 1928 book, Propaganda, as civilization becomes more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which public opinion may be regimented. With printing press and newspaper, the telephone, telegraph, radio and airplanes, ideas can be spread rapidly, and even instantaneously, across the whole of America. These tools would be fully utilized to begin the destruction of America. The secret goal of the Fabian Society was to create a godless, classless, socialistic society that was dedicated to the ultimate victory of socialism, which really meant communism. In 1891, they became affiliated with the Second Socialist International, established in 1889, and helped establish a democratic socialist state in Great Britain. The aims of the Fabian Society was developed by Webb, from what Englishman John Ruskin, 1819–1900, taught at Oxford University. Ruskin, a teacher at the Working Men's College, founded in 1854 by Christian socialist philosopher J.F.D. Maurice, a professor of fine arts at Oxford, an artist and writer, based his views on those of socialist Robert Owen. He advocated a utopian society, and espoused theories developed from the teachings of Plato, 428–347 BC, who had studied under Socrates, and became the greatest philosopher in history. Plato established an academy which operated for 800 years, producing many great men, including Aristotle. In his work, The Republic, he outlined his ideal society, which was an aristocratic society ruled by the elite. It included the elimination of marriage and the family, and introduced selective breeding by the government, who would destroy all inferior offspring. In Plato's Utopia, sexual equality dictated that women would fight alongside the men in times of war. The Fabians were working towards a new world, by indoctrinating young scholars who would eventually rise to power in various policymaking positions throughout the world, by infiltrating educational institutions, government agencies, and political parties. Their strategy was called the doctrine of inevitability of gradualism, which meant that their goals would be gradually achieved. So gradual, that nobody would notice, or without breach of continuity or abrupt change of the entire social issue. The secret was evolution, not revolution, or what Webb called permeation. Shaw, whose mistress, Florence Farr, was a witch in the Order of the Golden Dawn, revealed that their goal was to be achieved by stealth, intrigue, subversion, and the deception of never calling socialism by its right name. In fact, that's how they got their name. The name originated from the Roman consul, General Quintus Fabius Maximus, the cunctator, delayer, who through patient, cautious, delaying and elusive tactics, during the early phases of the Second Punic War, 218–201 BC, enabled the Roman army to regroup and defeat Hannibal's stronger Carthaginian army. One good example of this concept is television. Ever since Bible reading and prayer have been taken out of schools, the entertainment industry has been slowly and methodically taking bolder steps in the content of their programming. We are seeing things being televised, which would have never been considered 30 and 40 years ago. Nudity done in good taste, or done to be culturally or historically accurate, is acceptable. Obscene language is tolerated, especially on the radio, if it is an essential part of the plot. Even though the level of sex and violence is increasing, the rate of complaints to the television networks is decreasing. This shows a gradual acceptance on the part of the public, or what the network bosses call the relaxing of moral standards. This was done to brainwash our children, to constantly bombard them with trash that would influence them, and turn them away from God. This is so evident with the concept of music videos, which have been able to combine sex and violence along with a hard-driving musical composition that has been shown to ferment rebellion in young people. In 1905, American Fabians established the Rand School of Economics in New York City. On September 12, 1905, 5 of the Fabians met at Peck's restaurant in New York's Lower Manhattan. Upton Sinclair, well-known author and socialist; Jack London, well-known fiction writer; Reverend Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a Unitarian minister; J.G. Phelps Stokes, and Clarence Darrow, legendary lawyer. They incorporated the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, for the purpose of promoting an intelligent interest in socialism among college men and women, and established chapters at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, New York University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Their true purpose was to begin to-Christianizing America. One of its founding members was John Dewey, the father of progressive education, whose philosophy consisted of atheism, socialism and evolution. In 1921, they changed their name to the League for Industrial Democracy, whose purpose was education for a new social order based on production for use and not for profit. They established a network of 125 chapters. Dewey would later serve as its vice president, and in 1941, became its president. The Fabians had broken away from the Liberal Party in the 1890s and contributed to the founding of the Labor Representation Committee, which in 1906, became the Labor Party. Shaw called for wire-pulling the government in order to get socialist measures passed. In 1918, the Labor Party adopted a program which implemented the ideas of Fabianism. In 1931, the new Fabian Research Bureau was organized, joining the Fabian Society in 1938 to form a reorganized group. In 1940, the Colonial Bureau of the Fabian Society was established, and in 1941, the Fabian International Bureau was formed, which catered to international issues. In December 1942, the Fabians published the Beveridge Report, written by Sir William Beveridge, later made a lord, who made a long list of promises to Britons, if they would accept his package of social reforms. In 1945, Fabian socialists took control of the House of Commons, on the strength of the report, and the parliamentary reforms, which had been published 11 years earlier by Sir Ivor Jennings. Within a few years, British industries and services were nationalized and put under government control, which now meant that the Rothschild were able to control more, because all the banks were forced to use Bank of England notes, instead of their own. At its peak in 1946, the Fabian Society had 8,400 members in 80 local chapters. Among their members, Bertrand Russell, philologist, mathematician and philosopher; Pandit Motilal Nehru, father of India's first Prime Minister; Jawaharlal Nehru, and leader of the independence movement who founded the Swaraj, or Self-Rule Party; and Ramsay MacDonald, Prime Minister of England in 1924, 1929–35. Nearly half of all Labour Party representatives of the Parliament and the House of Commons were members, along with most party leaders. Today, from their headquarters at 11 Dartmouth Street, in London, they spread their ideas among teachers, civil servants, politicians, union officials, and other influential people. They publish the Fabian Review magazine. They also hold meetings, lectures, conferences, and seminars, do research in political, economic, and social problems, and publish their findings and views in magazines, books and pamphlets. Their concentration has been mainly on reforms to social services and the nationalization of industry.